Hello and welcome back to my LEGO Star Wars sequel trilogy sets retrospective. Last time I looked at the two main Millennium Falcons of normal scale that they've done over the past 5 years to cover this series, a full half decade there. And I got a lot of feedback from folks in the comments. I appreciate that very much. I read your feedback. I will be integrating changes based on what you've said and suggestions. I really appreciate that. And I'll continue to try to do better as I go on through this series. Today, I'm looking at the three main normal scaled X-Wings. Now, I also want you to know that not all the videos in this series are going to be like this, comparing similar things to each other over that 5-year span. I'm going to look at minifigures. I'm going to look at like the walkers. I'm going to go back and pick out my favorite things, my least favorite things. You know, different formats are definitely on the table and will be explored in the future. But for right now, let's talk about these X-Wings. A number of you asked for exactly this. So let's get to it right now. I've got the original Poe Dameron's one from 2015, right? So this came out for The Force Awakens. Striking color scheme. This is the Resistance one that just generic Resistance one, supposedly, that came out in 2016, so just a single year later. And this is the latest one, which has a copyright year of 2020. So we're seeing the entire half-decade spread here loaded towards the early side of that. Now this one, the main thing about this, just get right into it, right? The main thing about this is that it has a really striking color scheme, and that was not a decision by LEGO, of course. It was a decision by the folks making the film. And this is the type of thing where either you like it or you don't. I personally am a little bit torn on it, especially to this very day. I kind of like how brave it is, and certainly in LEGO form, the contrast is extreme. Like you look at other toys that have the ability to pick their exact plastic color or to use paint. They went with not as dark of a black. They went with actually a dark gray instead, and then more muted orange, and they're able to be a little bit more careful with their placement of it and everything. So the LEGO one ends up being really, really, really striking. Personally, I prefer the slightly more muted looks, which is funny and a little bit ironic because if I was playing a game of Star Wars where it was all about running my own ship and upgrading my own ship and, being able to pick my own livery, my own color scheme and everything, I'd probably go for something that's based on black and then has a really bright, contrasty accent color. But for something Star Wars for me, for something classic space sci-fi, I tend to prefer to see, for something canonical, I tend to prefer to see something that looks a little bit less like a racer, a little more quote unquote serious for whatever that is worth. So I personally am definitely biased towards more of a color scheme like this. We'll get to this one in a minute, but there are other things to talk about with color here. Specifically, my personal least favorite thing out of all the aspects, all the features of these three versions of X-Wing here. That would be them blue rubber bands back there. It's a tiny little thing. You can get different rubber bands and put them on there. But here's the thing. When I do reviews, I don't review the possibilities of modifications. I don't look at something and say, okay, well, there's how the LEGO designer did and how LEGO itself as a company released this to the public for everyone to build. But of course, everyone has a giant part collection and has the ability and interest in customizing. So anything that is wrong or anything that you don't like with or about a LEGO set, you can just fix. Anybody can just fix it. I don't approach things that way because it just wouldn't be fair. It would leave every single review saying, well, this has the issues, but anybody can fix it. Therefore, it's great. Oh, that was my fault. I just tried to grab it in a spot where I should not have grabbed it. But yeah, so with this, it really, really bugged me then, continues to bug me now, that this uses the blue rubber bands. Blue is just so close to 180 degrees away on the color wheel from orange, and then it's all contrasted against black. So it just screams, this is visually, aesthetically wrong to me. But there's also something that is not quite right about that whole setup there with the blue rubber bands in more of a functional way. You can see a little bit of it from the side here. The engines are actually kind of like they're tapered inward. Like the top ones are tapered down, the bottom ones are tapered up. Like this is actually kind of being bent inward a bit, and I can kind of like fudge that a little bit, and that's actually another small but noteworthy issue here. But ultimately, the mechanism to open the S-foils into attack position is via a knob on the top. That's nice and black, so that doesn't stand out a lot. On the bottom probably would have been better, but opens the thing up, and ultimately there's a little pry bar, rotating pry bar in the center. So you've got the rubber bands pulling down here, and then you've got this bar in between that's pushing from the center. The net result is that this is pinched at the back and it's a little bit more open at the front. You don't have anything to balance the force on the other side of the wedging bit. This is a little bit violent in how it opens and closes, but that was an issue that would be addressed later on. There's actually an additional issue with these engines, the way that they're attached. I actually fixed them to the best of my ability without changing any parts, just with how I assembled this. But Lego does appear to have recognized the small little, very, very fine design issue with using this stack of two half-thickness lift arms with the short axle there, and also taking this whole assembly and plugging it into a hole that is partially blocked, where you can't push this in all the way because the parts that hold their hinge plates that hold the rubber bands on there, hopefully you can see that a bit there, hopefully, those pieces actually get in the way. So there's a 1/2 plate. This is all relevant. Trust me, it's little stuff, but it's relevant. There's a 1/2 plate offset to pushing these in, so you don't push them in all the way. And as a result, if you don't assemble it absolutely perfectly, these things can fall off easily. That's what it ultimately comes down to. I used my fingernail and pushed the axles in just a little extra, so they're not perfect. Down here, an order of operations matters there, but Lego has to worry about things like that because ultimately it results in what we consumers feel is a design flaw or cheapens the whole thing. So there was an issue there that was very real and very tangible. Another one that's a little bit small, while we're still talking about these S-foils, but a lot of people noticed it, that there's a gap. Like I'm looking at you right now, through the gap when these S-foils are closed up. Like these panels, these plates come together pretty close, but then there's a full plate worth of gap in between there. And that's something that the T-70 X-Wing of the sequel trilogy should not have had. Like one of the nicest things about the new design was not just how the engine halves or inlet halves come together, but how the wings themselves or the S-foils themselves come together. And this kind of failed at that. And it's not too difficult to at least fill in that gap, but a little better interlocking between the top and bottom halves would have gone a long way, would have made a lot more people happy. So that said, let's move on from 2015 and look at the next one they did in 2016. They had a little bit of time to perhaps correct some issues with this. And right off the bat, they did correct one issue, and I don't know if it was 100% intentional. I feel like it probably was, but it may just have been a result of just part availability and color availability and cost. But here for the engines, rather than using a stack of two half-height lift arms, they use just a single lift arm there. So it's a single piece, just a single piece. Instead of two, that just leaves a little less room for this axle to move around. So ultimately, it just makes for a slightly better connection. And these engines did not fall off quite as easily. They still can, though. There was still that half plate thickness offset back here for the hinge plates that hold the rubber bands, but ultimately it's better. But let's talk about those rubber bands again, because they're back and they're still blue. This time they're perfect. Imagine that, a color scheme that uses gray and blue, and they used blue rubber bands, blue additional parts, and it works. It fits perfectly fine. Again, yes, you can change the rubber bands here. You can find ones probably in black. Hopefully you can find ones that are good quality, like these modern ones, not like the old Lego ones are just regular rubber and they would disintegrate over time, stretch and then just lose all their power. These are pretty good quality pieces, but just the color choice there just avoids ruining the color scheme like these over here did. I mean, so frequently we Lego fans will complain about like seeing tan and red and the blue axle pins and long pins from Technic parts that just show through where we don't want to see that stuff. It's a similar sort of scenario here, but only with the rubber bands, because all that other stuff, yeah, there's a little tan piece on the back, or there's a little bit of tan that you can see back there, but otherwise the color scheme was executed pretty well here. What else with the mechanism was changed here? Well, opening it up, it's exactly the same. So once again, the foils are tapered down towards the back. There's a torsion there. There's a torque on it. And ultimately, you probably don't want to leave this like this with the S-foils open for years and years. It's just going to look a little bit worse over time, I believe, as that fatigue starts to set in. Otherwise, interestingly, again, this was just 1 year after this one. This is mostly just a recolor. There are some subtle differences, but most of this is just swapping out colors. So many things are done exactly the same. There was probably very, very little time given to this project because they already had one. It's intended to be the same thing. It's funny that they released this as Resistance X-Wing and not as another Poe Dameron's X-Wing by name, even though canonically this it came with Poe Dameron as the pilot, but canonically this represents the first one that we see Poe Dameron with in The Force Awakens. So the first official T-70 X-Wing to show up on the silver screen. The other thing, of course, about the T-70, I think I mentioned it a little bit, but you've got the combined inlets that come together. I think Lego did a pretty nice job with these. Both basically the same thing. I don't recall, I didn't look it up. I don't recall if they had done these fender pieces in silver before this. If they had, it hadn't been for too long. It was a relatively new piece, if not brand new. And that's really nice. It's not perfectly round, but the way they did it, I'm pretty satisfied with that. But ultimately over here, not a lot of changes were made other than to the color scheme. Now the sand blue was nice in there. But see, we're just mostly talking about color here. Now, one that I'm not showing you that actually fits into the timeline of Lego products, but not into the chronological order of appearance in universe, is the most recent normal scale, like this rough size, original Trilogy version X-Wing, which came out in 2018. Now, that one had a bunch of changes, including a big change to the mechanism, and they kept that change and that set of changes when they did the T-70 version for the Rise of Skywalker. So another one with a bunch of orange, but this time with white as the accent color. So now the mechanism was up here. Now there's that tan, all right, that I talked about that we don't like to see. It's not too bad, fortunately. I mean, this is a pretty colorful thing, but this time, instead of having a knob that you turn, it's a lever, and you push it forward, and it opens this up. Again, with kind of a mousetrap sort of thing. The rubber bands on this one are white. Thank goodness. They probably could have gotten away with blue for those ones at the back here because there is that dark azure in the color scheme. But white with a mostly white craft, thank you. Thank you for for getting it. Thank you for not using like red ones or green or something like that. That would have been really, really irritating and completely unnecessary. So that part works. The way that these engines are connected is different. The way that they're built is also different. These are not coming off easily. Like you have to work to make these come off. Like how all that goes together is a significant improvement. You're not able to get as much good detail and good coverage on top here through this slit where the mechanism goes. And there's also, with this version, this awkward thing on the bottom, which is intended to close the S-foils automatically when you put it down, but just shot off a spring-loaded shooter accidentally there. Took the bolts out of these, but not out of this one. Talk about that in a second too. But it just doesn't work that well. So ultimately you get this thing that just hangs down here. Fortunately, that is super easy to modify. You just leave it out. So if that bugs you, you can just leave it out. But it was a nice idea. But other than that, the build for this one is significantly different around these inlets. So at this time, it's another case of LEGO being able to evolve designs based on part availability. Here they had this part available. These quarter round curved parts. I think they call them bows. They call just about everything bows. But you see what they are in gray there. And that allowed them to create an actual circle on either side. That looks so much better. It's not perfect, but it looks so much better. And I'm happy. I'm happy for the designer to, that he or she was able to use this. Also, some new wedge plate pieces were available by this time. So you got some ability to make some finer detail without resorting to the use of extra stickers there, just smaller shapes. Also, these guys, the 1x2 by 2/3 wedge curves, those pieces, those are available. They're also used down here to give in some interesting, improved shaping and detail. And they also did the laser cannons a little bit differently. I think I saw more people complaining on this one about the length of the laser cannons and wishing that they were longer. I agree with that, but it's the barrel port, it's the thin portion that needs to be longer to give it a more aggressive look. Between these two, I think this is a better look, but size is very, very similar between them. There's something else that's different here. Well, a couple other things that are different here. While I'm talking about those lasers, and I mentioned the bolt, I accidentally shot off a spring-loaded shooter bolt. This one has just 2 spring-loaded shooters that it comes with. One under each side. So one there. Compared to the others that each came with 4. And I want to see 4 on this. It's one of the cool things about running an X-Wing is you have those 4 cannons. So if you're going to have the action feature, have it. Put it there. And I think it was better to have 4 on there. This went a little bit more for the aesthetics. See, it's more sleek up here by not having those. It's an interesting decision. I'm surprised that they actually were able to make that decision. I wonder what the debates were like between the different designers and folks involved in the review process, looking at action features and stuff. But ultimately, they went for a better look here. I respect that decision. I just think that a little more play value would have been better. And ultimately, us folks who want to modify stuff anyway can very easily leave something off. It's not a major modification that requires additional parts or anything. But yeah, small thing there. One other thing. Yes. No gaps. No gaps between those S-foils. So that's an improvement. Another thing that's important, another thing they got wrong on the previous ones that they fixed now. So there are a bunch of things that were made better. Maybe a couple things that aren't quite as good, but the overall shape, the overall proportions between these two, they're very, very similar. Very, very similar. So nothing really to talk about there. Overall, looking from the undersides, you do see a little bit more off color with this one, with some of the yellow that shows through, but also with those S-foils to help them blend. They used inverted 1x2 by 2/3 curved pieces, these dark azure ones, little stripes in there, to good effect. pretty good. And also, yes, this one has the rubber bands at the front of the S-foils as well, or at the front of the engine intake section. So there's more of a balance of force. Hey! Between the front and the rear on here. So it just makes more sense. They hid the ones up front really nicely in the build. Takes a little bit more finesse to get those in there, but it works pretty well. Progress, ladies and gentlemen. The part count went up ever so slightly from this one to this one to this one, but some of that can be attributed to the side builds, which I'm not even covering because they're just little things and they're not that important to me. Maybe I'll cover some side build related stuff at another time. Figures also I'll be covering separately, in their own comparison video. But overall, progress. I personally, again, biased towards this color scheme, but these are so similar. Slight change here, but otherwise practically just a recolor. This one introduces so many new things. And there are some other pieces also that I didn't cover with this one, but I think they've done overall a good thing. I would like to see this center section maybe hidden away a little bit more. Maybe if they could get that mechanism underneath, that would be great. Like get rid of this thing, put the mechanism underneath the actuator for it, maybe spread the landing bits apart. I knocked one off from the other ship to leave some room for that. And then you could cover this up and have nice detail up here, have that looking more realistic. I think that would be a good small evolutionary improvement. But otherwise, I think they're doing pretty good. And then, do something to make the lasers look even better. One major difference, objective difference between these and this. This costs $10 more. And they're all expensive. This costs $10 more after just 5 years. It's rough, always rough to see price increases like that over time, though it is inevitable. Let me know what you think about these. Which is your favorite look and which is your favorite build also? For me, I would take this build. Now that I say that, I kind of want to do it, but it would be better for me to spend my time working on my city, which is always too neglected. But I would like to do a recolor of this into this color scheme or something like that, or like a gray and red version. I mean, of course, I've got like I mentioned, the original Trilogy version of this design basically, but the T70, is a little bit more sleek, and I like how these inlets come together. But those are my thoughts overall. So not a whole lot of negative to talk about here. A little bit of evolution, and it makes sense over the span of a half a decade. And it is pretty typical, I'd say, from what I've seen for Lego and how they improve things, or attempt at least to improve things over time. And this is fortunately a case where they have not made something like super small. They've not added so much detail that it's increased the price by 50%. I mean, $10 it's $10. It's still significant, but at least we don't see here in this span of time a tremendous change for the worse, or a tremendous change in overall size and or overall value. Right? It's subtle. I think that's about all I have to say about this. I look forward to, again, your feedback. Please continue. Keep it coming. Let me know what you want to see me do. I have maybe not all the sets, but darn near all the sets, and most of the figures, an overwhelming majority of the figures for the entire sequel trilogy as well. And I'm just going back through them and getting some use out of them, going back and seeing that stuff. Some of it will be probably for the last time for me. I'm going to continue to hold on to these things for a while longer. It's a pretty big collection for me to hold on to. I have so many things that I go through, but I will keep some things a lot longer than I will others. But before I start thinning the herd a bit, as hype for the sequel trilogy dies off and Lego stops building sets for the sequel trilogy, now's the time to let me know what you want me to do with all of them. So thank you for your feedback. Thank you for watching this video. I hope that you got something out of that, at least in terms of understanding better how I feel and how I think about these things as just a fan, as opposed to as a reviewer. And I will talk to you again soon. Bye for now.